So I want to ask you both then, how do we fix this?
I do find it one of the great ironies of this celebration over the destruction of Parler that Parler began attempting to answer the question you just posed, Bree. Parler was not begun by a bunch of like MAGA hat wearing Trump supporters. Parler was begun by people who largely came out of like the Ron Paul libertarian movement. And one of the things that they set out to do was to create more permissive rules in the public square for how discourse was being conducted so that they weren't quite as interventionist about deciding what was and wasn't appropriate, which isn't to say it was anarchy. They did and do have terms of service rules, including prohibitions on advocating violence and moderators to enforce it, but they did want to make it more permissive. But the other component of the model that most people have just never knew about, because people cheering the destruction of Parler don't really know much about it except these little snippets they've been shown by the people seeking to demonize it. I mean, imagine if all you knew about Facebook and Twitter was a few posts that, my angry, like, toxic contributions. You would say, God,
we gotta
that's like
shut the AOC, shut this down.
Exactly. And that's what's been done to Parler. But the other component of Parler was they don't collect data about their users in order to monetize the activities to sell them to advertisers, nor do they algorithmically promote content by assessing and analyzing the preferences and taste of what the person is consuming. I'm not saying it's perfect from a privacy perspective, but it was intended to be a solution to both the increasing control and policing of our discourse by Silicon Valley giants, as well as what Zephyr was talking about. And like, I find it so ironic that, Google and Amazon and Facebook and Apple are feigning opposition to, radicalization and extremism. When people ask me here in Brazil, how is it that a country that elected in 4 straight elections over 16 years, a center-left party that was devoted to raising people out of poverty and was well within the kind of mainstream of center-left politics, and then suddenly lurched to this far-right extremist maniac? One of the main answers is actually an article that was done by the New York Times that was really well done, entitled How YouTube Radicalized Brazil, where they would have like 17-year-old Brazilian kids watching some like video game thing, and then they would pop a video from just some guy who seemed like he was authoritative, who would tell them that the 1964 coup and subsequent military dictatorship was not really a coup, but it was a glorious revolution against communist oppression, and completely radicalized them to the right, so that when Bolsonaro started saying, actually, the military dictatorship is better than what we've had for the last 30 years under this corrupt communist quote-unquote democracy, they believed it because they were primed to by YouTube. And Parler doesn't do any of that. And that's the irony of these companies feigning opposition to what Parler has allowed, especially since most of the people, if not all, who have been arrested so far in connection with the Capitol breach or invasion or whatever you want to call it, were active users planning and plotting on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, and not on Parler. So I think we just need to be very careful to realize that the emotions of the moment might be leading us to think certain things that aren't true. The other thing that I think, in terms of your answer, Bree, is I just want to kind of touch on the one area of disagreement that I do have with Zephyr, which is it stems out of the decision to ban Trump from these platforms based on the proposition that he was inciting violence or inciting insurrection. And the reason I'm so concerned about that view is because if it's true that Trump is guilty of inciting insurrection or violence, essentially anybody could be guilty of inciting violence and insurrection. One of the ways that Facebook has been deleting Palestinian activists and journalists for years when nobody really gave a shit, when the Israeli government would come to them and say, here's a Palestinian activist or a Palestinian journalist who's going too far, they're saying that not just that they're fed up with Israeli occupation, but that it's time to escalate our resistance to troops on our soil. And Israel would then go and say, this is hate speech, this is inciting of violence, one of our troops was just murdered, and you need to control this platform so that you're not inciting violence. And then Facebook would go and delete Palestinian pages. You could have, if I sit here for the next 5 minutes and rant and rave against Facebook and Amazon and Google as grave threats to democracy, there's a possibility that someone in your audience might hear it and get riled up sufficiently to say, you know what? These companies are huge menaces to democratic freedom and my freedom of speech. I think it's justified to go firebomb an Amazon site or go assassinate a Google executive. And then I could be accused of having incited violence. You guys, I've heard you many times talk about the Democratic Party as this evil, corrupt institution. So what happens in 2017?
You've heard us incite...
I don't do that. I've heard you guys, and you
have
have
heard us
agitated...
incite violence week after week on this show.
Exactly. So like some guy goes to a softball field where Republican congressmen are playing and shoots them up, including comes close to murdering Steve Scalise. And then it turns out that he's part of all these pro-Sanders Facebook groups that say the Republican Party is guilty of treason. And let's terminate the Republican Party. And then you say, well, they've incited this violence.
Well, Glenn, what is an incitement to violence? Like, what would your strict definition be?
So
I think you agree that you should not be able to go on Twitter and say murder this person. He lives here.
But as a structural matter, I don't think Glenn is talking about, what I was not talking about is what is a crime, which is a separate question. We're talking about what are the conditions under which a state actor, which I think is the appropriate way to think about a company like Facebook, not so much Twitter, just to be frank, they play different roles. And, but that a state actor like the public square, your sort of archetypal vision of the sidewalk, or could say, okay, this is a speaker that would otherwise have an ability to speak, but we are going to remove that ability to speak. That's the context. I want to be clear, not the criminal context, which is separately being debated. Yeah.
Yes, because
exactly. But Virgil, let me just quickly on your question, about what is incitement, because Zephyr's absolutely right. Obviously, constitutional law doesn't at all come into play when we're talking about what Facebook and Twitter should be doing.
Maybe it does.
But you're right. Maybe it does, actually. Maybe it does.
Or at least it should, we should revive.
At the very least, I think it's super instructive. So let me just really quickly tell you my two favorite cases when it comes to the First Amendment law. One is this case called Claiborne versus the NAACP. In the 1960s and 1970s, the NAACP in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, were advocating boycotts against white-owned stores, against stores that they believe were engaging in injustice. And they would have their leaders of these affiliate NAACP organizations give these really fiery speeches about the need to enforce the boycott. And members of the NAACP would hear these speeches, young, members who had just joined a couple of years ago, were super passionate, and they would go out and they would burn stores down, or they would physically attack patrons who were violating the boycott. And the state of Mississippi sued the NAACP leaders, saying, you're responsible for having riled these people up and incited this violence. And the state court of Mississippi ruled in favor of the state and imposed a bunch of liability on the NAACP, and it got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said unanimously that if you're engaged in protected political speech, saying that you think an election is fraudulent, saying that you think the boycott is justifiable, you cannot be held responsible for violent acts, even if your protected speech inspires those acts, if you're not intending to incite imminent violence. And then the other case is Brandenburg, which a lot of people know, where the state of Ohio had an anti-terrorism law that said you're guilty of a felony if you advocate violence against political officials. And a KKK leader gave a speech where he said, I think it's finally time to start taking vengeance against white leaders who have betrayed the white race, and we ought to start killing them. The state of Ohio arrested and prosecuted him under that statute and convicted him. It got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you're even allowed to advocate the justifiability of violence in the abstract. The one thing you're not allowed to do, said both cases, is incitement. And it was very narrowly defined, meaning essentially you're outside somebody's house with a mob assembled and you say to them, it's time to go burn down that person's house, where you're literally inciting imminent violence, essentially immediately. So you would have to have Trump speaking to a crowd or going on Twitter and saying not just this election is fraudulent and not just saying it's time to go protest at the Capitol, because lots of Democrats say that about the 2016 election, the 2004 election, the 2000 election. Those were stolen. They're fraudulent. It's time to protest. You need Trump to say, go attack the people in the Capitol,
it's time to storm
them.
The Capitol.
Yeah. And he didn't do that either not at that rally nor on Twitter.
Yeah, so Zephyr, I want to get you in here. When we're talking about the tweets we're talking about that got Trump banned were like, quote, the 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first, make America again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. And then to all those who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Those are the two tweets that were cited as the reason for banning Trump.
Right. And so I actually those particular tweets don't do it for me. The concern is the intent and lawlessness. And I would kind of be happy to continue this debate because I do think there was intent and imminent lawlessness. But I also want to just point out how totally untenable this is as a way to run a democracy. And so this is, I don't need to be kumbaya, but I actually do worry that if we talk too much about this debate and we move off of the craziness of this centralized power and actually use the moment, because there is left-right on the ground support for breaking up big tech. There is real anxiety about big tech power, and really move it to stop asking, is Zuckerberg doing the right thing? Is Jack doing the right thing? They are not my governors. My governor is Chuck Schumer. And so the question is Chuck Schumer going to take the incredibly strong Cicilline report and put it in front of the Senate? That's a real question that could then change this, because this is an untenable.
What is that report?
The 450-page report that Glenn mentioned at the beginning came out incredibly strong, looking at breaking up big tech, talking about their monopolistic governing power, the tyranny inherent in them. I mean, the language is there when you listen to Cicilline talk about it. This was not. It is, yes, it's about the economy and it's about driving inequality, but it's very much about undemocratic control of our systems. And as a practical matter, we aren't about to see that First Amendment case that we were just debating about. What I was saying was that anybody who says Facebook is not governing, I think we have a real problem there. That and probably not as a matter of contemporary jurisprudence. But if you look at the road not taken jurisprudence, where we looked at company towns and companies that were monopolistic, effectively playing state roles, I think that's a direction we could have gone in. And so I am playing a little bit of fantasy First Amendment baseball here. But as a way to talk about it, I think we should reject the idea that because it is a company, we don't care. Because it is a private company, we don't care. And second, to say we have a serious problem that we have to fix now. We have two serious problems. One is radical control. We do not want Facebook embedding itself with the political establishment and either banning or making choices about promotion to make for political favors. It's a huge problem. And I mean, the Obama administration was like this with Google. Like really sort of tied at the hip, and was a terrible failure when it came to regulating big tech. I mean, sort of a gross open wound. And the Cicilline report that just came out, among other things, just shows what a disaster the Obama years were by pointing out all the mergers they didn't stop, all the investigations they didn't do, all the things that the regulators didn't do. So I do want to focus on what can be done now so that we are not in a situation again where you wake up and are in a situation of genuinely fearing more violence and fearing that the president will play a role in that, and feeling like your choices are begging Zuckerberg or nothing. Those are terrible. It points to the sort of terrible constitutional design of our system that those are even the choices on the table. And right now there's energy, but we need even more grassroots energy to push forward the Cicilline report on breaking up. And then there's this secret stuff, not secret, but really powerful stuff in the Cicilline report that actually goes to if something like Facebook is going to be infrastructural. If we're going to say, okay, there's a value in having 3 or 4 and not 5,000 Facebooks or social media sites, then non-discrimination regimes should apply. And so what that means, if you're a train, is I can't treat Virgil Farmer differently than Glenn Farmer. I have to give the same prices, basically treat you all the same. And it means if you're social media, I can't actually be picking and choosing what content you see, that we're moving back to sort of like old eBay, where it's you see what, and old Facebook, you see what comes up as it comes up, and there's a lot of user control, and you say, this is public infrastructure, so we can't have a surveillance-based model.